They meant only to amuse themselves by humiliating Seren Whitmore. They had already spent half the evening turning their heads just a little too slowly when she passed, letting their eyes fall to the carefully mended cuff of her glove, the old silk at her shoulders, the calm expression that offended them more than any plea would have done. Once the Whitmores had entered rooms to smiles. Once their name had opened doors instead of inviting pity. But ruined fortunes travel faster than winter wind in Virginia, and by the time the candles were burning low at Mrs. Augusta Vale's assembly in December of 1772, Seren had become the sort of woman other women touched with politeness and discussed with pleasure once she had moved away. If stories of quiet endurance, dangerous bargains, and the moment dignity rises where cruelty expected surrender draw you in, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. Mrs. Vale had waited until a dozen nearby listeners could enjoy it. "My dear Miss Whitmore," she said with that bright, polished sweetness that always made Seren think of a knife wrapped in ribbon. "You have been so neglected this evening. We cannot have that. I insist you take the empty chair beside Mr. Ravenmore. Unless, of course, you fear him as much as the rest of us pretend not to." There was laughter at that. Not loud, never loud enough to condemn the speaker, only the careful laughter of people who wished to wound without admitting they had aimed. Across the room, Elias Ravenmore sat at the far end of a card table he had not once seemed to enjoy. He was a large man, broad in the shoulders, dressed without ornament, with dark hair touched at the temples by an early silver, and a face that did not invite familiar speech. The old stories about him changed depending on who told them. Some said his late wife had died miserable beneath his roof. Some said he had buried his heart with her and become colder than the river in January. Some said his business in shipping and tobacco had given him too much power to trouble himself over whether he was liked. The cruelest among the women called him the specter, for he had the look of a man who had walked through some private fire and left the ashes in his expression. Seren knew all the stories. She also knew Mrs. Vale had chosen him precisely because no lady in that room would have dared accept such a challenge. To refuse would confirm her weakness. To obey would make her ridiculous. To hesitate would give them everything they wanted. Seren felt the blood rise under her skin. She felt, too, the old reflex that had governed too much of the last year. Endure, remain composed, survive the moment, go home, and suffer later where no one could feed upon it. Then she looked at Mrs. Vale and saw something that steadied her, not power, not grace. Hunger. It was hunger that shone in Augusta Vale's eyes, the vulgar appetite to see another woman flinch. So Seren inclined her head and said, "How kind you are to trouble yourself over my seating, Mrs. Vale." Then she crossed the room. The murmur behind her swelled. She felt it at her back, like heat. When she reached the chair beside Elias Ravenmore, she expected, at the very least, surprise. Instead, he rose before she could touch the seat. The entire room stilled. He did not smile. He did not look amused. He simply drew back the chair with grave courtesy and said, in a voice that carried farther than it seemed it ought to, "Miss Whitmore will sit where she is treated with respect." It was not a loud rebuke. That made it worse. He waited until she sat, then resumed his own place. A man nearby coughed into his hand. Mrs. Vale's expression changed so quickly that only a careful watcher would have seen it. The brief crack in her pleased composure before she restored it. "Mr. Ravenmore," she said, laughing lightly, "you make us all seem wicked." His eyes moved toward her at last. "Madam," he said, "I would not rob you of any distinction that is truly yours." No one laughed that time. Seren kept her hands folded in her lap, though she could feel every gaze in the room resting upon her. Beside her, Elias Ravenmore returned to his cards as if nothing of consequence had occurred. But something had occurred. She could sense it moving through the room, changing shape inside every whisper that would follow before morning. For the first time in many months, Seren Whitmore had not been left alone in her humiliation. That should have comforted her. Instead, it frightened her. Because in Virginia, protection had a way of becoming another form of danger. By noon the next day, the story had outrun the truth by a mile. Seren heard one version from the baker's wife, who had it from a cousin employed at Blackthorne House. Mr. Ravenmore had been captivated by her quiet beauty all season and merely seized his chance to show it. Another version came folded inside a visit from Mrs. Lyle, who pretended concern while reporting that some thought Seren must have laid a trap for him. A third reached the Whitmore house by way of a merchant's clerk collecting on a note that was already 2 weeks overdue. People said Ravenmore had marked her out because a ruined girl was cheap to court and easier to govern than a woman with brothers, fortune, and a loud family at her back. Seren's mother bore these rumors the way she bore every new indignity, with a trembling effort at pride. Her father, once handsome in a careless, prosperous manner, now moved through the house like a man continually surprised to find that his debts had followed him indoors. He had invested foolishly, trusted weak men, and signed notes under the easy optimism of someone raised to think tomorrow would naturally mend whatever today had frayed. It had not. Their townhouse was in peril. Their remaining servants had been reduced to 2. The silver had gone piece by piece. Only good breeding and Seren's discipline still gave the dining room the appearance of a household not yet defeated. Perhaps, her mother said carefully that evening. If Mr. Ravenmore truly means, he means nothing, Seren said. But even as she answered, she knew that was not entirely true. Men like Elias Ravenmore did not rebuke women like Augusta Vale in public without reason. Whether the reason favored her or endangered her remained to be discovered. It was discovered 3 days later, when his carriage arrived at the house at an hour too respectable for scandal and too deliberate for accident. He was shown into the parlor. Her mother, after one startled glance at Seren, found a reason to withdraw. Elias remained standing until Seren seated herself, and even then there was a distance in him that made the room feel formal despite the cracked plaster and the fading carpet. "I owe you an apology," he said. Seren lifted her eyes. "For preventing a room of people from enjoying my disgrace?" A faint shift touched his face. Not quite a smile, not quite sorrow. "For making you more talked about than you were the hour before." "That was Mrs. Vale's doing." "It was," he said, "but I gave her matter to work with." Seren waited. He did not strike her as a man who called merely to exchange courtesies. "At present," he said, "there are rumors around my household which do not threaten me greatly, but may threaten certain business arrangements if they are given room to grow. I am told, meanwhile, that your family has enemies who prefer gossip to direct violence, because gossip leaves cleaner hands. That is a graceful description of our society. It is a lenient one." He reached into his coat and withdrew no paper, no contract, no vulgar display of calculation. He simply said, "I propose that we give them a different story to tell." Seren did not move. He continued, "Not an engagement, not unless such a thing became necessary, but an understanding. Public attention, formal visits, sufficient civility to suggest my intentions are honorable and your reception in my company welcome. In return, I would see your father's most immediate pressures relieved, quietly, without spectacle. I would also be in a position to discourage certain people from treating your name as open sport." For one raw instant, she thought she might rise and order him out. He saw it. "If this offends you, say so. I will not mention it again." "What would I be to you?" she asked. His answer came without haste. "A lady whose company I seek. Nothing less, nothing theatrical, nothing indecorous." "And what would you be purchasing?" Something sharpened in his eyes then, not anger, but attention. "If I meant to purchase you, Miss Whitmore, I would have insulted us both by speaking more plainly." She should have disliked him for that answer. Instead, she disliked how exact it was. "Why me?" "Because Mrs. Vale chose you before witnesses, and because what begins in ridicule can often be turned to advantage if one is willing to endure a little more of it. Also," he paused, "because you crossed that room when refusal would have been easier." It was the last thing she expected him to have noticed. "I have no gift for deceit," Seren said. "Most people who say that are wrong. You, I think, may only lack practice." He rose then, as if the matter properly belonged to her judgment and not his persuasion. "Consider it. If you refuse, I will still do what I can to quiet the worst of the attacks against your family. But if you accept, I believe the arrangement may serve us both." When he had gone, the room seemed altered by the absence of his stillness. That night, Seren lay awake, hearing rain touch the shutters in patient strokes. She thought of the bills in her father's desk. She thought of Augusta Vale's smile. She thought of what it meant, in a colony like theirs, for a woman to be powerless and respectable. Respectability alone had not saved them. Silence had not saved them. Endurance had become a kind of burial. The next afternoon, she sent him her answer. Yes. What followed was not courtship, as novels told it. It was strategy, dressed in good manners. Elias called twice the first week and once the next. He escorted her from church with visible, measured attention. He sat near her at supper when invited into houses that had lately forgotten the Whitmores existed. When her father's most aggressive note-holder withdrew his threat of immediate action without explanation, Seren understood that Ravenmore had already begun to keep his side of the bargain. Yet he never presumed upon his usefulness. He never touched her, except in those public forms necessity allowed, a hand offered to a carriage step, fingertips at her elbow before a crowded doorway, the grave pressure of his palm beneath her gloved hand during a dance so formal it could scarcely be called one. He asked no gratitude she could not freely give. And so she learned him. She learned that his estate lay on the river beyond town, where tobacco met shipping, and both met numbers in ledgers he knew better than most ministers knew their Bibles. She learned that the stories about his late wife were untidy because society preferred mystery to admitting how often it misjudged a woman in life and worshipped her simplistically in death. She learned that he kept a household run with such exact fairness that even those servants who feared his reserve did not accuse him of caprice. She learned that men who called him cold often meant only that he could not be flattered into folly. He, in turn, seemed to learn her in fragments she did not know she revealed. Once, when Mrs. Fenley remarked in a poisoned tone that some ladies were remarkably calm for women under financial distress, Seren replied before she could check herself, "Hysteria has never yet paid a creditor." Afterward, when they had returned to his carriage, Elias looked out the window and said, "You should use that knife more often." I had not known it was visible. It is visible to anyone worth worrying over. That, too, was a kind of lesson. At first, Seren imagined she need only endure the role long enough to outlast the gossip. But society was a moving machine. The moment one cruelty lost force, another took its place. Mrs. Augusta Vale adapted quickly. The first new attack came disguised as sympathy. "My dear child," she said one afternoon, within earshot of 3 matrons and a clergyman's wife, "it must be such a relief to have found a gentleman willing to be generous where fortune has not been." The words were smooth. Their meaning was not. A gentleman willing to be generous. The phrase traveled. Soon there were mutterings that Seren had exchanged modesty for maintenance, that the Whitmore debts were paid not by prudence, but by the price of her appearances, that Ravenmore, for all his severity, had simply chosen a ruined girl because gratitude would make her obedient. These stories did what Augusta intended them to do. They struck not only at Seren's reputation, but at the very terms of her understanding with Elias, turning protection into dependence and dependence into shame. She bore it for nearly 2 weeks. Then something in her changed. It changed not in a grand moment, but in a small one. She had gone to Ravenmore House to review with Elias the seating at an upcoming supper hosted by a magistrate's widow. They stood in his library among ledgers, legal volumes, and a globe whose faded oceans had seen more of the world than she ever would. He noticed her silence. "What is it?" he asked. She almost said nothing. Then she heard Augusta's voice in memory, soft as lace and sharp as broken glass, and the old habit of swallowing injury became suddenly intolerable. "They mean to make me appear bought," she said. His face hardened. "I know." "You knew and said nothing." "I was waiting to see whether the talk would burn itself out." "It will not." "No." The word hung between them. A fire in the grate shifted with a low sound. Seren looked at him steadily. "Then we should stop waiting." That was the first time he ever regarded her not as someone under his protection, but as someone standing beside him in judgment. "What do you propose?" he asked. She did not yet know entirely, but she knew enough. "I propose," she said, "that we begin to ask, who profits if I am disgraced and you are made ridiculous in the same stroke?" He watched her for a long moment. "Go on." So she did. Once Seren began to observe with purpose, the social world opened itself to her as if it had been waiting all along. She noted who went often to Blackthorne House and who left looking pleased with themselves. She noted the curious timing by which news of her father's debts seemed to sharpen each time Augusta wished to wound her more publicly. She noted a certain clerk employed by Mr. Vale in some shadowy capacity, and a shipping broker who had lately been too eager to speak of Ravenmore's supposed instability in commercial affairs. Piece by piece, she discovered what mere suffering had hidden from her. Augusta Vale's malice was personal, but not only personal. Her husband had entangled himself in ventures he did not fully understand. One of those ventures depended upon weakening Ravenmore's standing enough to force a favorable withdrawal from a disputed investment in shipping. Another depended on pressure placed upon smaller families already near collapse, among them the Whitmores, whose remaining property sat on land useful to men interested in storage rights near the river. Seren had been chosen as a target because she was vulnerable, visible, and, in Augusta's estimation, too timid to become dangerous. That misjudgment became the Vale's first true mistake. The second came when they tried to expose what they did not fully control. By then, the winter season had deepened. Governor Dunmore's circle prepared for one of the last great assemblies before Christmas. Such a gathering drew everyone who mattered and everyone desperate to matter. If a reputation was to be restored or ruined, one could hardly design a better theater. 3 days before the assembly, a sealed note was delivered to Seren by a trembling servant girl employed in a house too loyal to Augusta Vale to allow innocence. The contents were simple enough to chill the blood. A statement, unsigned but precise, alleged that Elias Ravenmore had purchased the appearance of Seren Whitmore's favor in exchange for settling Whitmore debts and securing future claims. It mentioned dates, visits, and sums only someone near the matter could have guessed at, though much of it was false. The implication was ruinous. If circulated at the assembly, It would destroy her and stain him beyond easy repair. Seren read it once, twice, then laid it flat on the table. Fear arrived first. Then clarity. She sent for Elias. He came within the hour. After reading the note, he asked, "Do you wish me to stop this by force?" Meaning lawyers, meaning money, meaning the cold machinery he understood well. Seren shook her head. "No," she said. "I wish to stop it in public." "That will expose you to more pain." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "You have had your share. Not enough, it seems, to satisfy them. So let us give them more rope instead." He stood at the window, one hand braced against the frame, looking out at the pale grounds as if measuring consequences against weather. "Tell me what you require." She did. On the night of the governor's winter assembly, Seren wore dove-gray silk altered so carefully from one of her mother's older gowns that only the most malicious eye could have taken pleasure in detecting the economy. Her hair was plainly but beautifully arranged. She had never looked more like herself, and never less like prey. When Elias offered her his arm at the entrance, the room altered around them at once. Conversations softened. Fans moved. Men watched with open curiosity, and women with that sharpened social attention by which entire lives could be judged before dessert. Augusta Vale was radiant in blue satin and false ease. "My dear Miss Whitmore," she said, greeting her before half the room had time to invent new theories. "And Mr. Ravenmore, we are all delighted." Seren met her smile. "How fortunate, Mrs. Vale. I had begun to wonder whether delight was still possible in this town without someone being sacrificed to produce it." A few nearby heads turned. Augusta laughed. The game had begun. For an hour, Seren did exactly what she had taught herself to do over the preceding weeks. She watched. She allowed the evening to advance. She let those allied with Augusta draw near and drift away. She saw the unsigned statement pass, folded small, from one hand to another. She saw a magistrate's wife read it and go pale. She saw Mr. Vale pretend not to notice what his own arrangement had set in motion. Then, just before supper, Augusta made her move. It was elegantly done. She approached a small but visible cluster that included 2 clergymen, a judge, the widow Mercer, Mr. Hale, the broker, several ladies of standing, and Seren herself beside Elias. With apparent reluctance, Augusta announced that a most painful piece of information had been thrust upon her, and that, for the protection of all respectable families present, she felt obliged to ask whether Miss Whitmore had been led into an unfortunate dependence under the guise of courtship. No one breathed. Elias stepped forward at once, but Seren touched his sleeve, only lightly. Still, he stopped. That was the moment Augusta lost, without yet knowing it. Seren moved one pace into the open space the others had unconsciously made. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She could also feel every bruise of the past year standing invisibly behind her. The sold silver, the late notices, the careful pity, the laughter at Blackthorne House, the cultivated delicacy with which society informed women that they might be ruined without ever being fully believed. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Your concern honors me." A rustle went through the listeners. Augusta held her expression. Seren continued. "Since we are speaking for the protection of respectable families, perhaps we ought to protect them from something more dangerous than gossip. We ought to protect them from those who manufacture it for profit." Augusta's face sharpened. "I do not understand you." "No," Seren said, "but you shall." She turned, not to the women, but to Judge Pembroke, a man too old and vain of his fairness to retreat once publicly addressed. "Sir, I have been informed tonight of accusations against my name. They are false. but they were not composed idly. They were composed to suggest that Mr. Ravenmore's assistance to my family was dishonorable, so that his reputation might be lowered while mine was destroyed. I ask only that if charges are to be entertained, motives should be examined also. Mr. Hale, the broker, made a movement toward the door. Elias's voice stopped him like a shot. "Stay, Mr. Hale." There was no raising of tone. Men like Elias Ravenmore did not need it. Seren drew out the second paper she had hidden within her reticule. Not the accusation, but copies of shipping memoranda and debt timings, quietly obtained through a clerk who preferred truth to imprisonment. She had not secured them alone. Elias had made access possible, but she had seen the pattern before he had. She had understood where insult touched money and where money sought disguise in feminine malice. She handed the papers first to the judge, then to the widow Mercer, whose brother sat on a council no one in the room wished to offend. "These," Seren said, "show that pressure upon my father's debts increased in striking company with efforts to draw Mr. Ravenmore out of a river storage investment from which certain gentlemen hoped to benefit. Mrs. Vale may say she merely repeated what society already suspected, but society seldom invents its ugliest stories without assistance." "Outrageous," Augusta said, too quickly. "Is it?" Seren asked. "Then perhaps you will explain why your husband's clerk visited our creditor the morning after your assembly at Blackthorne House, or why Mr. Hale, who has spoken so freely of Mr. Ravenmore's unsound judgment, stood to gain if Ravenmore withdrew, or why a charge against my modesty should happen to serve a merchant scheme so neatly." Silence spread outward, cold and perfect. This silence was different from the others she had endured. It did not press her down. It made room. Augusta looked toward her husband. He did not come. He was pale beneath his powder. Judge Pembroke, after a long examination of the papers, looked not at Seren, but at Mr. Vale. "I believe, sir, some explanation is now very much owed." The unraveling did not happen in one brilliant collapse. That belonged to plays, not life. It happened as true ruin often does. One man failing to answer cleanly, another refusing to support him. A lady stepping back half an inch as if distance itself might prove innocence. A broker turning red and calling a thing coincidence after it has already begun to smell of design. Augusta tried once more. "You expect us to believe," she said, voice breaking at the edges, "that this girl has uncovered a conspiracy where there is only unfortunate talk?" Seren looked at her fully. No flinching now. No soft retreat to spare other people the discomfort of her clarity. "You chose me," she said, "because my family was weakened, because I had practiced silence, and because you thought shame would keep me grateful for every injury not mortal. You were wrong." No one rescued Augusta from that sentence. Elias then spoke, but not to overshadow her. He did what he had always done best, gave force where force was needed. He confirmed the disputed commercial interests. He named the funds he had advanced to protect the Whitmores, not as secret payment, but as documented surety against predatory collection while their claims were reviewed. He produced, through his attorney standing discreetly at the room's edge, the legal forms proving the matter clean. And because he was a man whose word weighed heavily once he chose to spend it, the room received his evidence not as the whole truth, but as the structure within which Seren's truth could stand securely. By the time supper was announced, no one could pretend the evening remained ordinary. The Vales left before the meal. Mr. Hale was not invited to remain near the governor's table. Two women who had not spoken kindly to Seren in months approached her with the dazed politeness of those who realize too late that the person they joined in scorning has become dangerous to misjudge. Seren felt none of the triumph she had once imagined revenge might bring. What she felt was stranger and better. Lightness. as if some invisible hand long pressed to the back of her neck had at last been removed. When the assembly ended, Elias helped her into his carriage. They rode in silence through the winter dark, the wheels rolling over hard ground, the lamps throwing gold against the cold. At length he said, "You were magnificent." She let out a breath that trembled at the edges. "I was terrified." "I know." She turned toward him. "You stopped when I touched your sleeve." "Yes." "You might have spoken first." "Yes." "Why did you not?" He looked at her then with that grave attention she had come to understand as his deepest form of tenderness. "Because it was your victory, if victory was to be had, not mine." The words entered her so quietly that she could not answer them at once. Outside, the night stretched broad and black over the sleeping fields. In the weeks that followed, the town adjusted itself to a new arrangement of truths. The Whitmores were not restored to wealth overnight. Life was not so theatrical. But the immediate threats eased. Creditors who had scented blood grew cautious. Families that had once withheld invitations rediscovered old civility. Mrs. Whitmore wept in private and held herself straighter in public. Serene's father, humbled at last by coming so near to losing even the shelter of his daughter's name, became less careless than remorseful men usually manage to be. As for Augusta Vale, she did not vanish. Society rarely punishes its own favorites with the thoroughness it reserves for women who cannot defend themselves. But she was altered in the one currency that truly mattered to her. People no longer trusted her refinements. They heard calculation under her sweetness. They watched her too closely. For a woman whose power depended upon arranging the room before others knew they had entered it, such suspicion was a grave wound. And Elias Ravenmore, he became, for a little while, the subject of a new kind of talk. Not warm talk. Society is slow to forgive a man for being exactly what he looks like. But curious talk, respectful talk, the sort that replaces superstition when facts begin to embarrass it. Yet for Serene and Elias, the deepest change occurred away from witnesses. Their original bargain had been fulfilled, more than fulfilled. No law, no debt, no piece of gossip required them now to continue the appearance of courtship. And still he called. Still she received him. Still, conversations that had once moved carefully around usefulness began to settle into something more dangerous because it was freely chosen. He spoke more of his late wife at last, though never for pity. Serene learned that the marriage had not been cruel, merely unhappy in ways society found less interesting than scandal. She told him truths she had spoken to no one. How anger had frightened her because women were taught that composure was their only armor. How she had mistaken endurance for virtue long after it ceased to protect her. How shame could become a habit stronger than reason. "Will it leave entirely?" he asked one evening as they walked the bare edge of his winter garden. "Shame?" "Yes." She considered. "No, but it no longer rules the house." He looked out across the river. "I am glad." "And you?" she asked. "Will people ever cease calling you a specter in their heads, even if they grow polite enough not to say it aloud?" "No," he said. "But perhaps one person may know I am made of flesh after all." That was the first time he had come close to courting her in earnest. The first time the air between them changed by mutual consent. It did not happen all at once after that. Their affection grew the way strong things often do, quietly, under repeated proof. In church, in the exchange of books, in letters no longer strictly necessary but welcome, in the fact that he listened as if her judgment were not charming for a woman but valuable in itself, in the fact that she found, to her own surprise, that his reserve no longer chilled her. It sheltered her. Better still, it challenged her to speak plainly and be met plainly in return. By spring, the town had begun to expect what neither of them had yet said. Seren, however, would not mistake gratitude for love. She had learned too much for that. So when Elias asked if he might speak with her alone one afternoon in the parlor where their arrangement had first been proposed, she entered with a steadiness she had earned dearly. He did not remain standing this time. He came nearer. "Our understanding is at an end," he said. "It has been for some time." Yes. A softer expression touched him than the room had probably ever seen from his face. "I find I have no wish to end my visits with it." Her heart moved once, hard enough to hurt. Still, she made him continue. "I do not ask because you need safety," he said. "You have proved you can make it. I do not ask because your family requires help, though what is mine will never be closed to your comfort if you desire it. I ask because I have come to love your mind, your courage, and the rare manner in which you grow more truthful under pressure instead of less. I ask because my house has become less silent in the hope of you. I ask," his voice deepened, almost roughening, "because if you entered it as my wife, I believe I should count myself the fortunate one." Tears rose in her eyes, but not from weakness. Never that again. "Elias," she said softly, "when you first came here, I thought you meant to save a desperate woman by placing her under an honorable name. And now? Now I think you stood at the edge of a room where everyone had decided what I was worth, and you left the decision to me." He said nothing. He had always understood the weight of silence better than most men understood speech. Seren took one step toward him. "I will marry you," she said. "Not because the town has finally learned its manners. Not because I owe you anything. Not because I need shelter from ridicule." She drew a breath that felt like the first full one of a new life. "I will marry you because when they tried to make me small, you did not ask me to remain small in exchange for kindness. And because somewhere along the way, while I was learning not to fear my own voice, I learned that your name in my future no longer feels like an arrangement. It feels like home." For the first time since she had known him, Elias Ravenmore closed his eyes as though gratitude itself were too large to meet directly. When he opened them, the severity others feared had given way to something rarer and infinitely more powerful. Joy held in discipline. He bent and kissed her hand, not as a bargain, not as a performance for watching society, but as a man honoring the free consent of the woman before him. Their marriage took place in early May, under a clean sky and the watch of people who had once thought Seren Whitmore a nearly finished story. She entered the church not as a rescued girl dragged back from shame by a stronger hand, but as a woman who had walked through humiliation, studied the machinery that produced it, and learned where to place her own weight against the world. If some still whispered, let them. Whispers had fed on her once. They no longer could. By summer, there were those who liked to retell the tale of how Mrs. Vale's little jest at Blackthorne House had ended in one of the most discussed marriages in the colony. They told it as irony, as romance, as proof that Providence possesses a taste for humiliating the proud. Seren, hearing such retellings now and then, always thought they missed the truest part. The plot laid against her had indeed failed. The man they called the Spectre had indeed become beloved by the one woman whose good opinion was worth the labor of earning. A false understanding had indeed become a real marriage. But the miracle was not that she had been chosen. It was that on the night they expected her to be broken for entertainment, something in her had refused to bow all the way. Something had remained standing in the dark, waiting not for rescue, but for its hour. And when that hour came, She met it with open eyes. That was the beginning of everything.